Tonight, you arrive beneath the granite shadow of a fortified castle on the road to Tours in the 13th century, a landless knight newly home from crusade, charged to keep the peace as an investigator for a wary lord. If you enjoy this gentle journey, please consider subscribing. It helps us craft more quiet histories. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let torchlight, oiled mail, and the soft murmur of monks at their tallies ease you toward rest while feudal whispers drift through the keep. Feudal justice along the road to Tours moves at the measured pace of oaths and memory, and you step into it as one more sworn voice. In a seigneurial court under the Capetian kings, the lord presides from a bench in the great hall, while free tenants and vassals sit as suitors, expected to know the customs and help render judgment. Once, men might have walked barefoot across hot iron, or plunged a hand into boiling water to let God decide. But after the church forbade clergy to bless such ordeals in the early years of the 13th century, those tests began to fade into stories. In their place, written pleas, inquests, and sworn testimony grew, with neighbors called to speak to reputation, to land boundaries, or to the keeping of a promise. The language of judgment shifts from ordeal and combat to charters and seals, and a case becomes a bundle of parchments tied with string, each line of cramped script a strand in a net. You watch it take shape and learn the rhythm. The crier's call, the party's oath on the saints, the slow consultation with men called prudent and experienced, and finally the Lord's word, spoken in a voice meant to sound like custom itself. Around these local gatherings, the crown's reach stretches like a new road across familiar fields, and you ride it with equal parts caution and respect. Royal officers, bailies in the north and seneschaux in the south, move on circuits to hear appeals from lordly courts, to check accounts, and to summon men for service or scutage. They carry wax seals and folded writs, and their clerks measure out authority in ink, establishing that what once stood on a man's reputation now also stands on a line in a register. You hear of enquêteurs who ask sworn men about abuses, of royal sergeants who note bridges unrepaired and tolls taken without right, and of cases that climb from hall to hall until they reach the king's own court in Paris. The change does not smash the old order. It settles alongside it, like a new tower added to a curtain wall, altering how shadows fall. You serve in that overlap, aware that a misjudged quarrel can become a royal matter if it frays too far. Inside the castle that commands the road, the social order is as organized as its stones. At the top, the lord and lady hold household and district together, the lady's keys as weighty as the lord's sword, for she oversees stores, hospitality, and delicate promises. The constable keeps watch over the garrison, the armory, and the repair of engines and walls. The steward manages rents, grain deliveries, and wages, working through tallies and lists balanced against the accounts of mills and vineyards. A chaplain says Mass, and near him work monk accountants from a nearby house, their fingers ink-stained as they record dues in a hand that looks like disciplined knots. Sergeants-at-arms and mounted men share the yard with squires polishing bits and buckles, while cooks, scullions, and laundresses carry the smell of work from buttery to bakehouse. Stone and timber are laid out to make the household run. The gatehouse with its chain and winch, the outer bailey where carts unload, the inner ward where the hall sits broad and warm on a winter night, and the keep, heavy and self-contained, with its well and hidden stair, built to outlast a siege but also to house keys, chests, and books. The walls speak of war, with arrow slits, machicolations, and flanking towers. Yet most days they guard irreproachable things: sacks of rye, bundles of wax candles, a chest of pewter seals. The portcullis rises to admit drovers bound for tours, their bells chiming a rhythm older than banners, and drops at sunset with a groan that sets the pigeons fluttering. Granaries and cellars are tallied by candlelight, the steward's neat notches on tally sticks matched to the monk's entries in Gothic script. A miscount is a quarrel in the making. The well in the keep is tasted each morning by the sergeant on watch, a ritual that feels like piety, practicality, and fear folded into one. When an alarm is called, it is most often for a fire in the brewhouse or a brawl near the stables, not an army on the horizon. In this way, defense and administration merge. Walls keep enemies out and keep duties in, so rents arrive, records survive, and the Lord's reputation stands intact. Your own calling shifts with the times, and you feel the leather of new duties settle as you ride between hall and chapel. You went east when preachers promised a holy cause, and you return to find that chivalry has turned inward, its vows harnessed to household service, arbitration, and the protection of dependents. Clerical moralists have much to say about temperance, loyalty, and mercy. Romances praise prowess, but also courtesy. And in a crowded hall, the best blow is often the word that ends a quarrel before it begins. You steel yourself against sermons that smell of control, yet you need the church's literacy, the chaplain's hand to draft a safe conduct, the monk's skill to copy a list of tenants, the measure of a seal pressed into green wax. Your signet is a tool as necessary as your sword, and your visits to the scriptorium teach you to read faces as carefully as letters. The old ardor still burns when a horn sounds, but most days you are part emissary, part enforcer, a hinge between competing forms of authority. On the day you are summoned, the castle's rooms hold their usual murmurs, but the air is taut with things unsaid, and you feel the gravity of household law. The steward lies in the keep's inner chamber, a place of locked chests and quiet, and the talk in the yard is careful, naming only duties, not suspicions. You begin as the newer forms prescribe, by separating rumour from oath, by taking names and asking who saw whom, when, and in what light. Sergeants report a door unbarred before dawn. A scullion remembers a single candle burning late. A monk accountant notes a ledger page newly torn. Grain tallies have been out by a margin that matters to hungry mouths, and you trace the path of sacks from granary to mill with the patience taught by desert marches, saying little and listening hard. Without trial by ordeal, proof becomes a slow braid of small facts, and your questions work like fingers in that plait. The castle's defences turn inward as your inquiry moves, for a fortress is also a sieve that lets only the right explanations pass. In the gatehouse you study the winch and chain and ask which hand touched them in the night. In the buttery you check broken seals on casks, the way you once checked mail links for a weak rivet. You sit with the lady and speak of keys and of who held them by right. You pass time in the chapel and hear a sermon that weighs mercy against order. You move between monks who know numbers and knights who know faces, and you balance their virtues like weights on a scale. The stolen grain speaks of quiet hunger. the steward's smooth dealings speak of something more costly, perhaps promises to a rival who covets what this lord holds. Your task, you know, is not simply to find a culprit, but to keep the hall's benches filled with men who trust that justice here is sure, measured, and calm. Beyond the outer bailey, the road to Tours is bright with dust and rumour, and the thought of royal envoys gives every duty an extra edge. The constable drills the watch at the gate, the lady orders the hangings brushed and the table linen aired. The monks recheck their sums by candlelight, scratching quietly as if the quill itself could erase error. You make sure that seals are close to hand, that the steward's chest can yield a clear sequence of rents and dues, that the tallies of the mill's toll and the tithe are tied and labelled. The drawbridge creaks in its cradle as the chain is oiled. The great hall's benches are set square, and the Lord's chair is placed where the light falls simplest. In a time when the crown's eye is everywhere, appearances harden into proofs, and you feel how parchment can weigh more than a blade in the day's balance. Somewhere down the road, pack horses jingle and helmets glint like stray sunlit stones, and you prepare yourself to greet them with order written, spoken, and quietly enforced. The summons comes lightly, as if the runner is careful not to wake the hounds in the outer ward, and you rise with your sword belt in hand rather than buckled. You cross the packed earth where the farrier's coals glow to embers, pass beneath the hoarding, and step into the gloom of the keep, where torches gutter and men-at-arms stand at careful attention. It is not alarm that moves them, but the practiced stiffness of a household drilled to hold its shape in the dark. The constable nods once, and the porter closes the door behind you with a latch that clicks like a whispered prayer. You are led up the turning stair, where the stone wears smooth under heels, past slitted windows that admit the faintest river air from the road toward Tours, and toward a solar you know to be used for accounts, petitions, and the steward's long evenings. The key turns in the lock, and the door opens to a room that is orderly even in disturbance, rushes fresh upon the floor, a brazier dead cold, and a shape under a woolen cloak that tells you enough without demanding your eyes linger. You have been called because, in these years after campaigning abroad, your lord prefers your calm in close matters to the heat of your sword arm, and you prefer the quiet of questions to the din of trumpet calls. You stand at the threshold and breathe once, letting the torches smoke gently, and you take in the detail that will guide your steps. It is ordinary in its way that a household looks to its own when a sudden death falls within its walls, and this is a house trained in the customs of the realm. In the 13th century, folk in these lands understand that a lord's court holds wide powers over tenants and servants, and that crimes within his domain are first sifted by his officers before any royal hand moves. The constable secures the doors and the stair. The chaplain whispers for discretion and sets a psalm under his breath. The chamberlain notes who is present and who is called, and a preliminary inquest begins with oaths and recollection rather than proclamations and fanfare. Where once an ordeal by fire or water might have been demanded, it is now more common to take sworn testimony, to read marks on parchment and tally sticks, and to weigh reputation alongside circumstance, since the councils of the church have cooled the old trials. Your lord's lands fall within the king's growing shadow, with bailies and sergeants about who are quick to hear rumour of disorder, and papers matter more than they did when you first rode for Outremer. You have learned, not always comfortably, that chivalry here is exercised in diplomacy, in fair words and measured loyalties, and that the blade now leaves its scabbard more often for ceremony than for judgment. A steward sits at the hinge of all of this, and the room explains why his loss could unravel more than a single life. The steward keeps watch over rents in coin and in grain, tallies the abbey's tithe in sheaves, purchases salt and iron at fair time, and enforces the rights that force men to grind at the Lord's mill and bake at the Lord's oven. He is the hand that signs for a dozen nails and knows who owes 3 hens at Martinmas. He lists the yields of demesne fields, the condition of harness and the hire of carters, the fee paid to the smith for a broken share, and the arrears of a miller who runs the water a little too fast at night. He also carries the keys to the chest where the account rolls lie, in Latin sliced by French marginal notes from the monks who assist, and his wax seals confirm what the Lord has not time to see with his own eyes. In this year, envoys of the crown ride out to hear whether écus are offered in place of men-at-arms for the king's service, equage that many call scutage, and they will ask for muster obligations set out in writing, for proofs of loyalty, and for the calm of a village untroubled by whispers. If the man who can show them the sums lies dead in his solar, the Lord's authority sits on a chair with a broken leg, and every neighbour will lean to test whether it holds. This, you think as you step forward, is why the torches burn low, and the hall below is kept quiet when it would be easier to raise the hue. The constable guides you, voice barely raised, to the desk, where a ledger lies open to a page headed in a neat hand, the columns marked for wheat and oats and rye, with small circles where the steward had begun to reconcile stores against issues to the garrison. On the floor nearby, a broken bead of red wax is crushed into the rushes, and a fragment bears the shallow impression of a device too small to read by torchlight. A second piece sits beneath the chair as if it skittered there in some hurried motion. Near the oak chest, bound in iron, where account rolls are stored in their skewers, a thin smear of brown-red arcs like a finger dragged inattentively, not enough to suggest violence thrown wide, yet enough to tell you that the chest was touched after blood came to skin. A quill has rolled to the edge of the table and rests in a congealed drop of oak gall ink, and the sand shaker lies uncapped, grit scattered like frost across an incomplete sum. The window shows no sign of force, its shutter is barred within, and the only door is the one the constable locked after he found the body and sent for the chaplain first, then for you. You lift the cloak a hand's breadth and see what must be seen, not the gore of battle, but the stillness of a blow that found the throats hollow and took the voice of a man who spoke in numbers. You let the cloak fall back without weight. The chaplain crosses himself, and you nod, and you ask quietly who entered before the door was closed, and the constable recites 4 names, each tied to his post, each now in the antechamber under watch. So the old steps of response have been taken, and now the household waits for you to ask the first of many questions, because that is the shape your lord has chosen, instead of sending for the king's officer on a moonlit road. The knights of the retinue are restless with winter quarters and low allowances, and 2 of them have barked in the hall this week over the steward's refusal to release wine from the second cellar. They nurse the pride of men who bled for titles and now bargain for bread. The clerics who keep the accounts, Benedictine brothers from the priory by the river and the Lord's own chaplain, work close in this room and the adjacent oratory, their fingers stained and their patience short when parchment goes missing, or when tithes are argued with a reeve. The servants with keys include the chamberlain's boy who tends the brazier and the porter who carries messages at dusk. The cellarer's assistant comes here at set hours to reconcile measures of salt and grain, and the smith's apprentice was seen mending the chest's hasp a fortnight past. Keys in a castle are rarely single, and the ring hangs at the steward's belt while copies sit in the constable's coffer by custom. When the guards turn over the watch, each man touches the iron and speaks the same words, and tonight that ritual binds them to their stories. It could be theft not of coin but of food against a thin spring. It could be a quiet quarrel over tithes or the granting of tithe-free status to a new clearing. It could be something else that the broken seal represents, a message read and then hidden. You know that the king's men will ride through in days to weigh ekus against spears, to count heads on the muster roll, and to catch idle talk. You feel their shadow in the room as surely as you see the torches smoke. Your lord stands in the doorway for only a moment, cloak drawn close against the stairs' chill, and his eyes rest not on the figure under the wool, but on you. He says very softly that this must be resolved before the envoys come up the road from Tours, and that it must be resolved within his walls if it can be. He would prefer that no neighbor learn how the steward fell or why. He reminds you, with the gentleness that suits a command when it is absolute, that rents must be called, that the mill must grind and the oven bake, that the monks must balance their ledgers, and that nothing invites intervention like disorder. You bow as a man who knows the weight of words sworn on a relic, as much as those sworn on a blade, and you accept the charge without flourish. You ask for the names of those who last saw the steward, for the keys to remain where they are, for the guards to change as usual, but to touch the door each hour, and for the chaplain to keep his counsel until you ask again. Then you step back into the hall where the antechamber collects the breath of the castle, and you begin to draw the circle of questions close, quietly, to keep fealty whole and the revenues steady, and to hold your lord's face high when the king's riders crest the hill. The great hall wakes in a grey hush, and you move through it as servants clear benches to the walls, leaving a clean aisle between the hearth and the dais. Dawn light lifts the smoke in long ribbons, and on the trestle tables the steward's work lingers. Wax tablets scored with stylus lines, a small heap of tally sticks, and a coffer whose iron straps are cool with dew that crept in through the arrow slits. In a house like this, order is a daily oath, and the hall is its stage, where men swear fealty, witness agreements, and resolve quarrels by custom rather than by blood. After years of campaignings, you know how different this rhythm is from the march. Here, discipline rests on announced hours, bell-marked curfew, and the Lord's peace enforced by fines and penance before the seigneurial court. The chain of authority runs from lord to steward to constable and cellarer, each answerable for a part of the estate's life, and each accustomed to records that outlast memory. You understand that in the 13th century, The crown's agents prize well-kept accounts as much as strong walls, and that the church's scribes turn disputes into parchment, where words bind firmer than spears ever did. You begin with the constable at the hearth, his cloak smelling faintly of rain and horse, and you ask him to recite the watches from sunset to dawn. He speaks without bluster, naming the first watch at vespers, the second at midnight, and the last before Lord's, each held by 2 men who walk the rampart and the inner bailey with a lantern hooded against the wind. The watchword changed at sundown, he says, whispered from mouth to mouth, and entered on a wax tablet by the clerk, while the keys to the postern and the granary hung at his belt until curfew, then locked in a small chest by the dais. You ask about the night past, and he says the gate was barred, the portcullis lowered, and the horn not sounded, yet a groom swears he heard soft boots near the stables after the last prayers. He shrugs at that because the steward often walked late, checking locks and counting sacks by touch, both a habit of care and a sign of mistrust learned from hard years of scarcity. You note how his eyes slide toward the coffer on the trestle, and you sense that even the captain of guards measures his words when the steward's death turns routines into liabilities. The cellarer meets you beside the service door that leads down to the buttery and the grain stores, and his hands are dusted pale from rye. He tells you the measures by which they reckon the harvest and its usage, sacks tallied by field and threshing floor, weighed on a beam scale against iron weights stamped with the Lord's mark, and recorded as loaves worth to estimate winter's sufficiency. You ask him to show the inventories, and together you trace the entries for barley and wheat, then for rye, which sits lowest on the page because travellers and soldiers were fed on it when wheat was too dear. He mutters that 2 sacks of rye are missing, and he shows you a smear of chaff near the hatch that opens onto the yard, where boots have brushed and left a drift of husk against the hinge. He explains that access to the stores requires 2 men. His key and the steward's key must meet, and the bar must be lifted by both, a custom adopted after a lean year when a vanished under-steward took a share to sell at the market. You let the explanation hang while you study the scuffed threshold, and your thoughts settle on how rules create a cord that many hands must cut before grain can truly disappear. At the nearest trestle, the clerk smooths a roll of parchment and then opens his wax tablets, and you ask him to speak to the counting. He shows you a bundle of notched sticks, each split lengthwise into matching halves, one kept in the hall and the other carried by the reeve from the village. The irregular break, and the mirrored notches making fraud difficult when the halves are brought together. He says the first count is marked on wax with the stylus in a quick hand, then copied onto a fair roll when time allows, and a warmer place steadies the ink, and totals are reckoned twice, once by the clerk, and again by a monk who comes from the small cloister after prime. You ask about seals, and he points to cords and wax discs bearing devices pressed from rings, the lord's, the steward's, and a smaller sign from the monastic guest house, which sometimes helps keep letters safe as they travel. He indicates the chest beneath the dais with its 3 locks, and he explains that 1 key belongs to the lord, 1 to the steward, and 1 to him, and that no important paper is removed without 2 men present to witness it. You notice a blank space on the tally pile where a paired stock should sit, and you ask him softly where the missing mate might be, while he answers that the reeve from the riverside hamlet has not yet arrived, delayed by disputes at the mill. The cloister is a quieter room tucked near the chapel, where two monks keep correspondence on a lectern and a narrow table beneath a painted saint. You speak with them about debts and rents, and they lift out cord-tied packets to show you letters describing arrears from tenants whose fields flooded, along with a plea from the miller's family, who resent the Lord's right to compel grinding at the banal mill and thus pay dues in grain. They talk about the bridge down the road toward Tours, where floodwater stirred the footings so that carpenters must be paid for stout timbers, and whether the Lord or the parish ought to bear the greater share, a question the prior says should be settled in writing to avoid bad blood. You ask for their seals, and they show you a wax impression of their house's emblem, a simple cross and palm, and they tell you how letters are folded, slitted, and sealed, with copies noted in a brief register in case arguments arise later. You listen as they describe how the king's men have lately favoured written inquests, and how they hear that envoys will ask, not only for the Lord's oath of fealty, but also for proof his men kept the king's peace on the roads. You think about the change this represents, the slow drift from spear to spear justice to words and oaths laid down by candlelight, and you feel the old muscle memory of campaign settle into a new habit of patience. In the yard on your way back from the cloister, you pause to speak with a squire oiling harness, and he glances toward the chapel door before admitting, haltingly, that the steward had lately exchanged soft words with a lady's maid near the herb garden. He does not name the maid, and you do not press. You only ask whether the steward had enemies among the armed men, and the squire says most disliked his tally stick but feared his reports more. At the stables a groom leans on a fork and says he saw the steward's cloak near the stalls long after the bell, and he heard a whisper in a voice not meant for a stable boy's ears. In the kitchen, the cook ladles oats and tells you that her rye ran short a day sooner than her book allows, and she swears she saw chaff clinging to the boots of a man who claims he never steps near a storehouse. You consider how household discipline works. Minor rule-breaking punished by fines or service, graver offences submitted to oath and compurgation, with neighbours swearing to a man's character, and only after that to the ordeal-like certainty of the Lord's harsher justice. You remember how a knight at home is expected to mediate before he strikes, to gather vows and bind a quarrel with witnesses, and you know your work now is to pull threads without tearing the cloth. When you return to the hall, the light has strengthened, and the clerk finishes copying a figure as you kneel to peer beneath the coffer where the keys slept last night. Your fingers find grit and a curl of wax, and then a small hard ring, its side tacky with a dark smear that your eye knows before your mind names it, dried blood thin as paint. You cradle the ring in your palm and tilt it toward the light, and its device comes into view. Not the Lord's stag or the steward's tower, but a boar's head half-turned, carved with a craftsman's sure hand unfamiliar to this household. You close your hand around it before anyone else can see, and you ask the clerk another gentle question about missing tallies, while the constable stares out toward the yard, as if listening for hooves that are not yet there. The ring is a signet, meant to press wax and fix promises, and to carry a man's name on his letters. And you know it does not belong to any you have seen in service here. You slip it into your pouch with a lie already forming on your tongue, a small shield you will need until you can place this emblem on a map that might keep the peace a little longer. You follow the blood-streaked signet from the keep stair to the counting room, turning it over in your palm as if the metal might whisper. The device is not the lord's, nor the steward's. It bears a lean greyhound beneath a sprig of broom, a badge you have seen on the saddlecloths of men who ride with the neighbouring baron across the river. A signet in this age is a key as much as a jewel, a small matrix that presses identity into warm wax and makes words carry a person's presence. To find such a token out of place is to stumble on a door someone meant to keep shut. In the castle's order, the steward should have handled money and stores, the constable the garrison and gates, the marshal the stables and road escorts, and the chaplain the records of oaths. The fact that this token lay near the steward's last steps suggests those boundaries have blurred. You have seen that often, now that crusading retinues have scattered home and chivalry bends itself to household service. Men who once rode under a cross now guard granaries, chafe at rules, and trade favours in shadowed passages. You feel how brittle such hierarchies can be when tested, yet you breathe slowly and trace the engraved greyhound, reading it as a track left by a cautious animal that misstepped. You ask the cellarer to open the ledger chest, and the monk hands you a bunch of keys on a thong, their loops polished by years of habit. Letters and tallies live here under lock, because in a world where few can write, the seal serves as a voice, and wax does what signatures will do in later centuries. It fixes a promise with a mark all can recognize. The practicalities matter to your inquiry, so you examine a folded missive tied with flax cord, noting how it is slit so the end can pass through a cut in the parchment tongue before the wax is poured to bridge cord and fold. Break that bridge, and the letter's secret is wounded. You know wax is not only beeswax, but often stiffened with resin and coloured by vermilion or left pale. You have seen green used for weighty charters, while quick notes like this keep to simple hues. Men talk of clever thieves who warm a seal and lift it whole, but in truth the gloss dulls, and trained eyes among monks and clerks will see the tampering. To forge a seal is falsum, akin to perjury in both canon courts and the king's, and a man caught at it can lose his hand, his standing, or both. You remember that since the great council in Rome forbade ordeals, lords lean more on sworn testimony, written proofs, and careful inquests, so you treat every string and blob of wax as evidence that could hold up in a hall of witnesses. You find the thing you did not want. A letter slid flat behind the inner lining of the ledger case, hidden where the boards are worn smooth by generations of abbots' fingers. You work it free and see the seal is chipped, the impression of the greyhound smudged as if it were pressed in haste. The script inside is neat, likely a clerk's, but the content smells of the steward's voice and needs. It lists garrison numbers that match what you counted yesterday in the yard, and notes 2 crossbows with cracked prods awaiting glue and sinew, and then, in a curl of Latin shorthand, mentions hoardings planned for the south curtain, but not yet raised. The letter sets a calendar. A raid should meet the castle after the last carts from the Demazon fields have come in, and before the royal envoys arrive from Tours, a narrow window when men are weary, barns are full, and the Lord's attention is on parchment rather than parapets. It names the harvest in units you recognize, muids of wheat, setiers of rye, and closes with a price for betrayal that is half in coin and half in promise of office at the rival household. You feel the cool of the parchment and understand why such intelligence matters. A siege is not a storm of glory, but a sum of timbers, stones, bellies, and time. And if a rival knows your rhythms, he can choose not to fight at all, but to starve you by standing near the road and counting wagons. You pair this treason with the quieter theft that seeded the ground for it, because crimes rarely walk alone. The granary sacks are lighter by a hand's breadth when lifted, and the measures recorded on the tally sticks, each notch split across two matching halves kept by different hands, have been shaved with a careful knife, so that steward and monk hold halves that match but show a smaller sum. You crouch by the grain bin and sift, and chaff clings to your fingers, telling you clean wheat has left and poorer mix has been stirred in, a trick common in bad years and brazen in good. You speak with the reeve who stammers about a nephew who eats too well, and with a girl who keeps the kitchens and blushes at the mention of a sergeant's name. Favors have moved here like water, buying silence at the cost of a lord's bread. The cellarer tries to shield his brethren by talking of error, but his eyes flick to the steward's vacant stool, and you know that office anchored the fraud, making it safe for small folk to skim and for one man to barter the whole storehouse of information. You do not rage. You assemble the pattern as calmly as you would piece a mail shirt, ring by ring, from petty pilfering up to the careful promise to place a gate's key into someone else's hand. You weigh what to do while the bells mark none, and the courtyard settles into the hush of afternoon work. Your oath binds you to your lord, but over that lies the wider lattice of homage and fealty that ties lord to king, and in the 13th century that web is tightening as Capetian rulers send bailies and envoys to tame private wars. The old right to take arms over a slight or a boundary shrinks each year, and a baron who is caught plotting a raid during royal scrutiny risks more than a feud. He risks censure, fines, and the cold attention of men who can strip a fief. If you expose the agent whose token you hold, your lord must answer with force, or be counted weak by his peers, and either path invites a clatter of harnesses that will echo to taws at the wrong hour. You who own no land and eat at another's board cannot afford a misstep that makes you look like a stirrer of strife. Your value lies in keeping the hall steady, in solving without spilling. You think of the inquest the envoys might convene if the keep erupts, the sworn juries from neighboring villes, the questions asked, the sharp quills recording every lapse, and you feel how easily your master's house could be weighed and found wanting. You walk back through the great hall with the letter folded beneath your cloak, the signet warmed by your skin, and you look at people you must keep safe from their own rashness. The constable grips a goblet and jokes with men who would gladly take a banner to the road if you gave them a name, while the monks murmur over scratched numbers and pretend the world turns on ink. You understand now that the steward's game was larger than his purse. He planned to trade knowledge of hoardings and harvest for place, and he salted the fields with petty theft, so that when the blow fell, hunger would weaken the will to fight. You could put the greyhound on the table and demand oaths, and the lord would call his knights, and the rival baron would claim slander, and a dozen tenants would wake to torches in the night. You breathe in the smoke from the hearth and decide to move softly, because the crown's peace is a blanket thin as linen and easy to tear when men reach for steel. You accept in a quiet way that does not ask forgiveness, that the naked truth would split this lord's alliances wide open, and that survival, yours, and perhaps the Shire's, will depend on saying less than you know. You choose silence over spectacle, and you begin with a tale that offends no neighbor and calls for no banners. In the 13th century, a castle's strength lies not only in stone, but in the orderly stories its officers can tell. So you sketch one that fits the season and the times. Hungry men slipping in at dusk through a postern drawn by the scent of full granaries. The outer ward is busy at that hour. Smiths banking their fires, swineherds returning, guards trading jokes as the watch changes, so the imagined shadows can pass in the bustle without breaking the rhythm of the place. You note that the Barbican gate was repaired last month, and the moat runnels are low, small facts that make the invention more believable. If bandits had tried, this would have been the moment. On the road to Tours, traffic swells with pilgrims and carters bound for the cathedral city, and travellers speak often of petty theft as harvest nears. Your version borrows their commonplaces for cover. You offer the Lord a simple shape of events, bandits, a scuffle, a frightened steward, and you keep the sharper edges hidden in your pouch, where the bloodied signet and the treacherous letter rest like secrets that must not become torches. In a feudal household, where justice is the Lord's to dispense and peace is his duty under royal eyes, a plausible story is a necessary wall. You plant proofs that neither point to kin nor cry out for feud, assembling traces that feel true because they are ordinary. In the ditch below the postern, you press a half-heel mark with the butt of your dagger, rough and wide as a farm shoe, then step it twice toward the hedgerow, the sort of stride made by a man in haste and poor boots. On a path used by woodcutters, you arrange a knife whose blade bears no cutler's stamp and whose hilt bears no colours, a tool that could be anyone's, from the margins where names do not travel. At the toll house by the river, you persuade the keeper to recall, honestly, for he does remember, 2 strangers with straw in their hair and cloaks too thin for this damp, trudging toward the east as the light failed. You know how heraldry speaks even when men are silent, so you avoid buckles with engraved beasts, avoid spurs with distinctive rules, avoid any item that might invite a herald to read a family's shame. You let the under-constable discover the track at first light, because watchmen are proud of their vigilance, and pride will carry your story forward without you needing to press. It is an old craft of household knights in peacetime, this tending of appearances, less glory than a charge at a gate, but closer to the service your oath requires. You bargain next with numbers and with faces, choosing repair over display. In the counting room where the resident monks pencil with a patient hand, you restore to the rolls what the steward skimmed, shifting sacks to match the parchment and marking the tallies to agree with the bins. Setiers recorded against setiers in place, and the measure of a muid returned to the ledger where it had gone missing. You draft scrip for restitution in kind to those the steward wronged, a remission of next week's corvée for a widow who paid twice, an extra ration of rye for a tenant whose children bowed under short waits. You keep it quiet, because manorial justice is best when the hall remains calm, and because in a lord's court amercements and redress are custom, not theatre. The two grooms whose tongues strayed near the baron's agent you do not ruin. Instead, you send one to a sheepfold on a distant demesne, and the other to a troop mustering with the seneschal, where his loyalty can be watched and retrained. You speak with the prior about the steward's clerk, whose figures grew flexible when the steward glared. The prior suggests a transfer to the priory's grange at a safer remove, and you agree without punishment, for complicity often begins as fear. This is what passes now for chivalry in lands at peace, not a lance lowered, but a tally corrected, a life redirected, a grievance tended before it breeds sharper trouble. You do not love parchment, yet you bend to it, because writing moves faster and farther than a rumour. In Tours, the cathedral canons keep correspondence with the king's agents, and the royal clerk who oversees tolls near the bridge sees many seals in a week. You compose a memorandum in a practiced, formal hand that names dates and places but not the baron, sets out a pattern of questions, and closes with a seal that is the Lord's office mark, not his arms. You pass it through a messenger whose business is deliveries for the abbey, so that church errands cloak the errand you need, and you include a copy without signature for a canon known to trade letters with the prévôt who answers to the bailey. The Capetian administration prizes such discreet notices, and in this century of inquiry and reform, from Paris into Touraine, clerks assemble fragments into files that can one day steady or unsettle a baron's fortunes. You keep your own conscience steady by letting the record carry what your voice must not, remembering that Louis and his jurists have taught lords to prefer written truth over shouted claim. You seal the flap with plain wax and no flourish, for the less the eye pauses, the farther the packet travels without comment. In this you accept the church as ally, despite unease, because quills and chapters reach where mailed riders cannot without raising dust. When the royal envoys arrive, they do so with courteous gravity and a memory for order rather than outrage. Their tabards show the lilies of the crown, and they ask first for the accounts, rolls of expense, lists of rents and tallage, the monks' neat columns that chart grain, wine, and salt from last Martinmas to now. They walk the stables and the armoury, counting helms and hauberks, and they ask you to call the men by name. Sergeants, squires, archers, so they can mark the muster complete, a reminder that feudal service and scutage both owe discipline as well as coin. They speak with the watch about hours and passwords, nodding when the under-constable describes the new patrol pattern at dusk, and they examine the pastern hinges as if to praise the smith's work. In the hall, they take a simple meal and listen to the steward's temporary successor explain the bandit incident, and they accept the tollkeeper's note of strangers on the road as a corroboration that fits the season's mischief. Their report, read aloud with mild voices, calls the household orderly and loyal, a place where the king's peace holds and the Lord's hand is steady. They leave the sense that Tours will hear nothing troubling, and that the lilies are content. You bow with your lord, and the household exhales in that way a hall exhales when auditors find balance instead of breach. By the time the sun is a thin ember beyond the hedgerows, you are on the road, hooves soft in the dust where pilgrims' sandals have worn the earth. The land between the Loire and the forest hums with small lives. Cartwheels whisper, owls trade their low questions, and the wheat-heads mutter in the breeze. And you let the quiet teach you what your sword did not. You think of chivalry turned toward guardianship, of the oath you took reshaped for an age that prizes parchments and prudence, and you measure justice as balance rather than vengeance, as a ledger where peace must remain in the black. You consider the steward's schemes and the baron's hunger, and you accept that truth sometimes travels better in a sealed packet than in a public accusation that would set banners unfurling. You ride with no retinue, your shield covered, content that the king's men found order where they looked, and content that the monks will keep the numbers square while the fields ripen. In the muted light, you let the feel of the rain soothe your hands, a prayer without words, and you turn your horse toward the next village where a reeve quarreled with his neighbors over water rights, a quiet inquiry awaiting steadiness more than steel. You do not hurry, because in this gentle country, the work is to arrive before anger does, and to leave with the night untroubled. The road to Tours drifts into twilight, and you let your horse choose the pace, listening to the soft clop of hooves and the distant wash of the Loire beyond the hedgerows. In this French countryside of the 13th century, power is measured in quiet arrangements as much as in iron and banners. You carry no pennon tonight, only a steady breath and the cool weight of choices made for the sake of a fragile peace. You have come home to a land learning new rhythms. Once, the call to distant crusade gathered the realm like a wind across wheat, pushing men outward toward glory and loss. Now the wind curls back into the valleys, into market squares and manorial courts, into the patient ledgers of monasteries. Chivalry does not vanish. It changes posture. The code that once blessed the charge now blesses restraint, and the most faithful courage is sometimes the hush that prevents a shout. Behind castle walls, you have watched how authority moves, the lord in his high seat, bound by oaths to a crown that grows more exacting. The steward balancing rents and rations, the marshal and constable ensuring watch and forage, the chaplain advising from a scripture that also shapes law. A castle is not merely stone, but a layered household where each stair and threshold defines who stands where. In such places, justice travels slowly, through counsel, through custom, through the recollection of what was done last winter and the winter before. Even appeals rise step by measured step, from hall to county court, and sometimes to the king's agents whose seals carry the weight of the realm. You move among them as an emissary who has traded trumpet blasts for careful words. The church's lamps burn late over parchment, and the rustle of vellum can feel as fateful as the clink of mail. Monks keep accounts that tether harvests to promises, penning numbers that determine whether a village knows want or comfort. Their ledgers, like your blade, are instruments of order. You respect what they protect, and you keep a cautious distance from how far their counsel reaches. Between chalice and sword there is a narrow aisle where you walk, asking what service means in a season that prizes steadiness over spectacle. This evening air is kind, and the road is honest. You think of the oath you renewed within yourself, not the shouted pledge of a levy in arms, but the quieter vow to keep the Lord's peace without letting truth drown beneath it. There is an art to it, older than any crusade, to bend the reed and not break it, to see the pattern in a field of small signs, to let the realm breathe. A signet can open doors. A word spoken at the right hearth can close a wound before it bleeds. Somewhere behind you, torches thread the battlements, and watchmen trade the hour with low voices. Ahead, a wayside shrine flickers with a tallow flame, and a traveller has left a sprig of rosemary for safe return. You don't ask for absolution. You ask for clarity, for the patience to recognize which troubles must be eased and which truths must be carried forward like a sealed letter to the proper hands. This is the craft of peacetime knighthood, to ride between powers that both claim the same ground and leave the soil undisturbed. A night bird skims the hedgerow. Your horse stretches into a longer stride, content. The world narrows to the leather's creak and the slow breath of a creature that trusts your touch. The road will bring you to another hall, another quiet oath, another conversation beneath a painted beam. The crown sends envoys, the church keeps its books, the lords tend their hearths. You, in the middle path, keep the current from breaking its banks. Let the cool air settle around your shoulders. Let the Loire's hush be the only counsel you need for now. You have done enough for this turning of the stars. When morning comes, the dew will silver the grass, and the realm will still be where you left it, tilled, taxed, prayed over, and, for tonight at least, intact. Breathe and let the horse carry you gently onward, while the castle lamps dwindle to amber sparks behind you, and the road softens into sleep.